All right. Well, after a little bit of a break, because we took some time to actually look into Islam last week, we are continuing through the book of Philippians, and now we're into chapter 3. Just to give kind of a reminder of the wave tops here of where we've been, we saw in chapter 1, Paul the apostle is in prison, and the Philippians are commended because they stuck with him, not just when times were good, but also in bad times, which Paul saw as really a genuine fruit, wonderful fruit uh, of their salvation, the genuineness of their faith. And we talked about how, it's not just that the fact that anybody can be a Christian, say they're a Christian when times are good, but when times are hard and there's a test, that's really when it shows, right? Job worshiped the Lord in spite of the difficulties. That was the test. Um, then we saw in chapter 1 at the end how there's a strong witness to the ungodly of this world when in the face of strong persecution, we stand together with a battle mindset. We stand together unified in the faith, not afraid of their threatenings. And then we got into chapter 2, and we saw that what really, when we're unified in the faith, the biggest danger for us is that we could be divided from the inside. And so, starting in the beginning of chapter 2, we saw the recipe for unity and really building towards the example of Christ, having the mind of Christ, not to be self-centered, self-seeking, but to be really selfless and sacrificial and serving. We saw that in the example of Paul, willing to be poured out as a drink offering. We saw in the example of Timothy, who naturally cared for others, just like Christ. We saw in the example of Epaphroditus being willing to risk his neck for the furtherance of the gospel and his fortitude to push through trials and difficulties in love. So we saw all those examples, and now that we've had the example of the true way of walking in the mind of Christ, walking after Christ, after that example, now into Philippians 3 verses 1 and 2, Paul is going to give a warning here. He's going to give a warning to beware of some certain characters that show up, and they show up throughout the Bible. They show up in the amongst professing Christians. He calls them dogs here. Even he calls them the concision. Let's just read verses 1 through 2 here, and then we'll get into this and see really how this opens up. He says, "Finally, my brethren, rejoice in the Lord. To write the same things to me indeed is not grievous, but for you it is safe. Beware of dogs, beware of evil workers, beware of the concision." Now, let me just say, first of all, about this command to rejoice in the Lord. This is a continuing theme throughout the book of Philippians. And that is, as we've seen, that's really where our unity is based, but it's also where our joy is based. We saw earlier, as we've studied the first couple verses of chapter 2, how Jesus is called the consolation of Israel. He's the comfort. Without Jesus, there's only darkness. Without Jesus, there's only death. There's only eternal destruction, right? All of our hope, all of our joy, everything is all bundled up in Jesus Christ. It's all in Him. And so, you talk about rejoicing in the Lord, right? Some people think when they think about rejoicing in the Lord or delighting in the Lord, it seems like they think about it only on an emotional level. So, that I guess, you try to get amped up with music. Of course, music is an external thing, right? Music is something that, yes, the truth of the lyrics of the music, the truth can go into your heart and work from the inside out. But the actual music in terms of the instrumentation and so forth, not the lyrics, that can be very powerful emotionally. Um, but again, that in itself, it just works from the outside in, which true spiritual worship works from the inside out. That's why we always focus with our music. We want our music to be the lyrics to be focused on being truth giving, clear and truth giving, because we know that true worship and delighting in God and rejoicing in Jesus Christ goes from the inside out, and it's intelligible. Uh, my point in bringing that up is some people think that rejoicing in the Lord is just this emotional thing. And it can kind of be like this foggy idea, like ambiguous, like just kind of good feelings without really much substance to it. Just this kind of, whipping yourself up into an emotional frenzy with music, doesn't really matter what the lyrics are so much, and all this. And rejoicing in the Lord, it is really to be not just on an emotional level, it's to be spiritual. You look at Jesus. Jesus always had joy. He always had joy, but yet he was called a man of sorrows, right? In the outward sense, he dealt with all this, suffering and tiredness on dusty roads that we deal with, and enemies against him. And yet he always had joy. He always had joy because of the rejoicing in God, the rejoicing in salvation, these kind of things. And so we shouldn't just put it on to an emotional level when we're talking about rejoicing in the Lord. It really is an emphasis on rejoicing in the Lord and in the light of the Word of God and the rich truths of the Word of God filling our minds and our hearts. And the emotions, yes, that happens. The emotions are going to be affected. But it's not just emotion in itself. So we're to be always rejoicing in the Lord. And we're going to see that theme pick up again as we go through this passage. If you go to the next part of the verse, it says, "To write these things to you, to me indeed is not grievous, but for you it is safe." And then he says, "Beware of dogs, beware of evil workers, beware of the concision." All right, this is where we really get into it. Let me change my slide here. All right, now let's talk about beware of dogs. A little bit of background here, because this really opens up. Uh, People throughout the Bible are actually described as animals, clean animals or unclean animals. Now, if you want to get into the details of this, you'll go back later to Leviticus, Leviticus chapter 11 or Deuteronomy chapter 14, where you have the symbolic laws dealing with what animals are clean and what animals are unclean. Okay, but all through the Bible, especially in the New Testament, um, people are described as animals, and sinners or the ungodly are described as unclean animals. So, very interesting. Just give you a few examples. The dog returning to its own vomit, and the pig returning to the mud in 2 Peter 2:22. Dogs and pigs are unclean animals. Uh, John the Baptist called the Pharisees a generation or a brood of vipers, and vipers, unclean animals, snakes. Jesus referred to Herod as that fox. Fox is an unclean animal. In 2 Corinthians 6, it tells us not to be unequally yoked with unbelievers. The reference is back to Deuteronomy. There was a law prohibiting them from yoking up an ox with a donkey. But in this case, it's talking about people, clean people with unclean people. So, but it's referencing a Old Testament passage about animals. And even also, by the way, Christians are referred to by clean animals. So I'll just give you the example of 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Pastor is compared to an ox treading out the grain, a clean animal. And of course, sheep. We know sheep in the Bible. We're the sheep of his pastor, so on and so forth. So it goes on and on. But anyway, if you look at Acts chapter 10 and look at the vision that Peter had when he was up on his rooftop, he had a vision, he was in a trance, and he saw a sheet coming down from heaven, went up and down 3 times, and it had all these. I don't know if this image is accurate here, probably not. It doesn't look like it. But anyway, it had all these unclean animals in it. And God said to Peter, "Rise and eat." And Peter's like, I haven't ever eaten any of the unclean animals. I'm not going to do that. And God said, what God hath cleansed, don't call common, right? And so Peter's like wondering, what does this mean? Is God undoing the dietary laws? Well, at that very moment, then 3 Gentiles show up at his doorstep. And so basically, through the course of this, Peter connects the dots. He gets what the vision's about. It's basically, look, the Jews, God's chosen people, quote unquote, clean people, right? They're no longer to view the Gentiles or the non-Jews as unclean. They would think of the non-Jews as unclean, right? And now that wasn't to happen. This goes along with the gospel going to all nations. But there again, you see the the idea here is that these dietary laws refer to people. So this helps us understand things, just as you're going through your New Testament and you see people being described as by animals titles. For instance, here in Philippians 3, where Paul says, "Beware of dogs." Okay, obviously not literal dogs, but people. people who are unclean, who are defiled by sin. We're going to talk about that. Also, I think it would be worth our while to look at the time when Jesus calls the Syrophoenician woman a dog. He says it's not good to take the children's bread and give it to the dogs. That would be another something we might look at as well later. Um, but anyway, he connects this. If you look down at Philippians chapter 3, verses 1 through 2, okay, he not only says beware of dogs, indicating people who are unclean in some manner, they're spiritually unclean. They're defiled people somehow. But it says beware of evil workers. Okay, that gives us a little more. And then it really narrows it down here. It says beware of the concision. Beware of the concision. The circumcision, which if you go through your New Testament and you look, the circumcision was a name um, that, well, it's often used of the Jews in general, okay? But when it talks about the concision here, okay, when it talks about the concision, that is talking about Jews who, even after the resurrection of Christ, they were saying that you had to be circumcised to be saved. Okay, now what is circumcision? It's the cutting away of the flesh of a male child, usually on the eighth day. It's goes back to Genesis 17. God gave this ordinance for Israel. It was to be the mark of God's chosen people that they were circumcised. Every man child among you shall be circumcised the eighth day. Eight is the number of renewal there. And it was called a token. Okay, the circumcision was called a token. Um, and the rainbow was also called a token. So it was a symbol. That's the idea, is it was symbolic. Even back then, they should have known it was a symbol of something. Um, and circumcision was hugely significant. I hope we can understand that for the Jews, this was majorly important. This was seen as the sign, the mark of being amongst God's covenant people. And if you didn't get circumcised, physically circumcised, you were considered cut off from God's people. We're going to see that in a minute. But anyway, it's called a token, okay, or an outward sign. And that's what Romans 4 tells us that circumcision was. It was an outward sign of an inward reality. It says that circumcision was a sign of the righteousness of the faith that Abraham had. So, um, now here's an interesting thing, okay? If you look at Genesis 17, when God gave Abraham this ordinance of circumcision, he said, every male child among you shall be circumcised the eighth day. And anyone who's not circumcised, he said, they will be cut off from among their people. So either your flesh is cut off or you're cut off from God's people. This is very important. Either your flesh is cut off or you're cut off from God's people. Think about that. Now, that word for cut off, I have it there on the screen, karath, if I'm saying it right. It means to kill, eliminate, or cut down, but it's the same. It's used in Genesis 17, but it also shows up, interestingly, in Genesis 9 with the flood, when God says, after the flood, never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood. All flesh was cut off. Interesting that it would use the same, flesh and cut off together. Now, going back though to this idea that if the flesh is not cut off, you're cut off, it really explains in Exodus 4 why God was about to kill Moses. It says God was about to kill Moses right after calling Moses in Exodus 3. God was about to kill Moses because he had not circumcised the flesh. He had not cut off the flesh of his son. And Zipporah, his wife, quickly took a sharp stone. She circumcised the child, and Moses was saved. And so this shows you that he wasn't showing any partiality. Either you cut off the flesh or you get cut off. That's the idea. But if you look at it, it's very interesting. All the what this teaches us here, when you think about the flood, okay? What the flood, before the flood, the whole world had corrupted itself with wickedness and violence. It was the flesh, right? Um, and and it was the flesh out of control. And God cut off the world of ungodliness during that flood. And First Peter tells us that was actually an illustration of the water of regeneration washing away the old man, cutting off the old man, so to speak. So it gives us that vivid illustration of the old being cut off and then renewal when Noah steps out of that ark. So according to Peter, uh, the world being cut off, and then through the ark, through salvation, there's a newness of life. There's a newness of life that comes out of that. And the ark was the conveyance out of the old into the new. That's a picture of what happens spiritually to us through the cross. Through the cross, the old is cut off. Same language used of the flood. The old man is cut off. The old man of the flesh is cut off. And then we have newness of life. See? So, I'm going to prove this right now. Go to Romans 6, and you'll see that the cross is the means by which the flesh is cut off. Our flesh is cut off, and we have newness of life. So, Romans chapter 6, okay? All right, here we go. If you go down to, all right, verse 6, Romans 6, verse 6. Knowing this, that our old man is crucified, okay, with him, with Jesus, that the body of sin might be destroyed. Remember that word, it means destroyed, cut off, that henceforth we should not serve sin. And so the cross is God's divine knife of circumcision to cut off the flesh so that we can have new life in Christ Jesus. And it's so neat how these words connect through the scriptures. But anyway, so what does it all come down to? Okay, let me simplify this, because if I lost you, just this is all you need to realize right now. Okay, circumcision for the Jews was a physical thing, cutting away of the flesh, male foreskin. Okay, it was a physical thing. It was symbolic of the cross, and what the cross, through the cross, our old man, the old flesh, sinful flesh, is cut off, right? As the principle of our life, it's cut off. Crucified with Christ, that henceforth we should no longer serve sin, and now we have the newness of the Spirit. So neat to think about these things. In the Old Testament, we have a pattern of those whose flesh is not cut off. Okay, and I'm building toward the concision here. I'm building toward the people that Paul is warning about. He says, beware of dogs, beware of the concision, okay? Because here's what I'm getting toward. Here's what I'm about to prove. I'm going to prove that the concision, these Judaizers, these Jews that said, oh, you must be circumcised to be saved, I want to prove to you that they might have been physically circumcised. They might have had the outward fleshly sign, but they didn't have the reality that it symbolized. They were still in the flesh. They were still in the flesh. So the Philistines in the Old Testament are a picture of this, okay? Remember the Philistines, they're the uncircumcised Philistines. That's what they're known as. Remember Goliath? He's called that uncircumcised Philistine, right? That was the Philistines. The Philistines the name actually means wanderers, and they entered into the promised land by a shortcut. They didn't come like Israel by the way of Jordan, right? Which symbolizes coming through by the way of the cross. They came via Egypt, all right? And so they came in the wrong way. They came in the wrong way. They entered in the wrong way. It might remind you when Jesus in John 10 talked about those who come in by another way, right? And not only did they come in a wrong way, they were known in the early times, during the times of Isaac, as the well stoppers. These were the guys that when Isaac would dig a well, which is a picture of true spiritual life, tapping into grace, they would stop up the wells. Okay. And this is what people who are in the flesh, right? They may be religious, but they're fleshly. Okay. This is what they do. They stop up the wells of grace with their works systems. That's what I'm getting towards. So if you look at Philippians 3, verse 2, okay, look at that, look at those. It says they're called dogs and evil workers. And look what they're being contrasted with. We're going to get to this next week, Lord willing. Look at what they're contrasted with in Philippians 3, okay? It says, beware of the concision, verse 2. Now, verse 3, for we are the circumcision, okay? Does it say who have the outward mark? No, because 1 Corinthians 7, Paul says circumcision is nothing. He said, we are the circumcision which worship God in the spirit, as opposed to what? Just worshiping in the flesh. Oh, you just have the outward sign of circumcision, but you don't worship God in spirit. And what? Rejoice in Jesus Christ. What did he say in verse 1? Rejoice in the Lord. What are these people rejoicing in? Flesh. Flesh. Look at it says in verse 3. We rejoice in Jesus Christ. We're the true circumcision. We rejoice in Jesus. We have no confidence in the flesh. These people make it all about the flesh. They make it about their works. Oh, you got to be circumcised. You got to do this, that, or the other to be saved. See, they make it about them. And the true circumcision makes it all about Jesus. The true circumcision is people who are, their flesh has been cut off. That all that pride and self-righteousness has been cut off through the cross. All of that has been cut off. And now our only confidence and all our rejoicing is in Jesus, not in ourselves, not in works we do, not in religious works. It's all Jesus. See? And so, and so it's warning us about people who they're fleshly. They claim to be true worshipers of God, but they're all about talking up the flesh and the works of the flesh. Here they are. This is the description of these folks. Okay? This is who we're being warned about. Who the Philistines were a picture of these people. Formalism. People who are they're meticulous in their religion, outward fasting, tithing. Okay, they're like the Pharisees. They're very disciplined, but it's to compensate for wicked hearts. They don't have true inward grace. All they have is dead external religion and legalism. Works righteousness. They add to the finished work of Jesus Christ, just like the concision. Oh yeah, we believe in Jesus. We believe in the cross. Oh, but you got to be circumcised to be saved. See? The example of this today would be the Roman Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, others who want to add baptism to say you got to be baptized to be saved. It says, beware of these people. Beware of these people who are saying you got to add the flesh works to the finished work of Christ, right? 2 Timothy 3. I'm going to read real quick. I'm going to read this because it's so important. It says that we're going to be dealing with the concision in the last days. It implies that we're going to be dealing with the dogs, the concision in the very last days. It says in 2 Timothy 3:1, for this know also that in the last days perilous times shall come, for men shall be lovers of their own selves. See, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy. Unholy. See? Without natural affection, truce breakers, false accusers, incontinent, fierce, despisers of those that are good, traitors, heady, high-minded, lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God. And then it says in verse 5, having a form of godliness, but denying the power thereof. From such turn away. And so they have outward religion and wicked hearts. See, you can see 2 Timothy 3, 1 all the way down to 4, wicked hearts. And then verse 5, outward religion. That's what the Pharisees had. Wicked hearts, outward religion, right? They were whitewashed tombs. They had tons of outward religion, but wicked hearts. Jesus said they were filled with ravening and wickedness. And what do they end up as? Persecutors, just like Paul before he got saved. It always leads to persecuting the true people of God. It always leads to that. The concision will always persecute the true circumcision who rejoice in Jesus Christ. Always. That's what it leads to. So there's an example there of it's interesting that the very last enemy in the book of Judges was the Philistines. Samson was the one who fought them. And it parallels with this because it says in the last days, this is what we're going to face. This kind of Philistine mentality, uncircumcised, meaning they're all alive to the flesh. They're fleshly. They may have come into the land, but they came in a wrong way. They came by works, right? They've wandered in by works. They're claiming they have a claim on salvation, and they've came in by works. They came in a wrong way, and they trouble the people of God. That's why he says, beware of the concision, beware, right? We have a picture with Samson. Just like in Judges, the very last enemy was the Philistines. In 2 Timothy 3, the very last enemy at the last days is going to be these people who have wicked hearts but outward religion. Samson was eventually conquered by the Philistines. And how? He gave in to lust. That's why he was conquered. That's how you become a Philistine. If you give in to lust, that's how you become part of this concision. If you give in to lust, you're giving up true worship. And all you can have is the dead outward stuff then. If you give your life to lust, all you're going to have left is the outward shell, and you're going to end up being part of this dead outward religion and inward corruption, right? And that's symbolized, I believe, Samson was conquered by the Philistines. He gave into lust, and he was conquered by the Philistines. Conquered by the Philistines. So anyway, I believe this has a lot to do with that spirit of Antichrist working in the world, with just the hearts growing cold. It says, because iniquity shall abound, the love of many will wax cold. Jesus talked about that. I won't have time to go really into that too much. But I think that has a lot to do with this, that people are going to be lured into a dead outward religion, right? And Paul is saying in Philippians, he's saying, beware, that we need to be on guard. Beware of dogs, beware of evil workers, beware of the concision, because we are the circumcision, the ones that really worship God in the spirit, not just in the flesh, right? We do outward things. We go to church, we sing songs, we do things outwardly. It's of course, but it has to be from within, from the inside out, not coming and being formalistic and going through the motions, but our hearts are wicked. That is a recipe for Pharisaism. So, um, anyway, we'll get more into it as we go through. There's more to be said, but I think it's important to have an understanding of circumcision, what it means, and the real symbolic purpose of circumcision in the Old Testament, and it can really help us to learn about how works righteousness can creep in, especially when we understand how Paul uses it in the New Testament. All right, let me go ahead and end here. If you're watching online, feel free to reach out to me. You can go to BayRidgeBaptistNYC.com, click on contact, it goes straight to my email. But in any case, God bless you and have a good night.